Before we get into this list, understand what 1975 actually was for R&B and soul music. It was the year Natalie Cole announced herself to the world with one of the most confident debut performances in the history of the genre. The year Barry White was at the absolute commercial peak of his career. The year David Ruffin, who most people associate with one voice, one group, one era, delivered a solo record that should have redefined an entire legacy. It was a full, rich, extraordinary year of R&B and soul music that produced records of lasting quality, and then watched most of those records disappear from the cultural conversation within a decade. These are 15 of them. Some you will recognize immediately, some you may be hearing again for the first time in years. All of them ruled 1975, and all of them deserve to still be in your rotation. Number 15. Gladys Knight and the Pips, Part-Time Love, 1975. By 1975, Gladys Knight and the Pips were 2 years removed from Midnight Train to Georgia, the record that had finally given the mainstream audience the full accounting of what this voice was capable of. They were on Buddha Records. They were at the commercial peak of a career that had been building since Gladys was a child performer in Atlanta. Part-Time Love reached the R&B top 10 and demonstrated that the commercial momentum of Midnight Train to Georgia was sustaining across subsequent releases. The record is a direct, unambiguous statement about a specific kind of romantic arrangement, part-time, provisional, never quite the full commitment the singer needs delivered with the specific authority of a vocalist who has been communicating exactly this kind of emotional precision for 20 years. What makes it a forgotten record rather than a celebrated one is the specific shadow that Midnight Train to Georgia casts over everything Gladys Knight recorded in the mid-70s. The defining record of a career tends to make everything around it slightly less visible, the records that preceded the peak, and the records that followed it are all evaluated in relation to the peak, rather than on their own terms. Part-Time Love deserves its own terms. On those terms, it is a very good record from one of the great voices in the history of soul music. But before we go any further, if nobody ever told you about this channel, think about how close you came to never finding this. Don't let that happen to somebody else, and don't let it happen to you again. Hit subscribe right now, turn on notifications, because where we're going next in this story, you cannot afford to tap out. Alright, now back to it. Number 14, Leon Haywood, I Want to Do Something Freaky to You, 1975, before Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg sampled the groove on Nothin' But a G-Thang in 1992 and introduced it to a generation that had no idea where it came from before the sample became one of the most recognizable in the history of hip-hop. Leon Haywood recorded the original in 1975 and reached the R&B top 5. The record is built on one of the most effective bass and guitar combinations of its year, a groove that moves with complete inevitability. That sounds like it could not have been arranged differently. Because every element is in the only position that makes sense. Leon Haywood was a working soul and R&B musician from Houston, Texas, whose career stretched from the mid-60s through the early 80s without producing the sustained commercial profile that his best records warranted. I Want to Do Something Freaky to You was his biggest moment, a record that connected with the audience immediately and that demonstrated Haywood's ability to build a groove from the inside out rather than from the outside in. The feeling comes first. The arrangement serves the feeling. Everything else follows from that sequence of priorities. The hip-hop sample gave the record a second life that Haywood himself could not have anticipated. But the original deserves to be heard as itself, not as the source material for something else, but as a complete piece of 1975 R&B that earned its chart position on the strength of what it actually was. Number 13, Diana Ross, Satin Soul, 1975. By 1975, Diana Ross was navigating the transition from Motown to a new phase of her solo career, one that would eventually include the move to be righteous. May your heart always be RCA Records and the late 70s disco-era material that would produce Upside Down and I'm Coming Out. The mid-70s records she made during this transition are among the least discussed in Her catalog, which is a specific failure of the critical and popular conversation around her work. Satin Soul is a Motown production from 1975 that demonstrates the specific quality of her voice in a mid-tempo soul context, warm, slightly husky in the lower register, completely controlled in a way that sounds effortless because the controls has been so thoroughly internalized. The production is clean without being cold. The arrangement gives the vocal room to move rather than surrounding it with orchestration. It charted on the R&B chart without breaking through to pop in the way that her biggest Motown records had. And it has been largely invisible in the subsequent discussion of her catalog, overshadowed by the iconic Supremes era on one side and the disco-era solo hits on the other. The mid-70s Diana Ross records are a specific gap in the public understanding of her range. Satin Soul is evidence that the gap is worth filling. Number 12, The Moments, Look at Me, I'm in Love, 1975. The Moments were a New Jersey vocal group, Al Goodman, Harry Ray, and Billy Brown, who had been working the R&B circuit since the late 1960s and had developed one of the warmest, most precisely calibrated harmonic sounds in the genre. Not the Philadelphia international sophistication, not the Motown polish. Something more intimate, a close harmony vocal style rooted in the doo-wop tradition that the group had absorbed and adapted into a contemporary context. Look at Me, I'm in Love reached the R&B top 10 in 1975 and demonstrated the group's ability to take the simplest possible emotional premise, the specific bewildered joy of new love, and deliver it with a conviction that made the simplicity feel like truth rather than limitation. Harry Ray's lead vocal is the record's center, warm, slightly rough-edged, completely present in a way that the more polished soul productions of the era sometimes sacrificed in pursuit of commercial smoothness. The harmony work underneath supports rather than competes. The production gives the voices exactly what they need and nothing more. The Moments had been making records of this quality since 1970.
So much, ladies and gentlemen.
They would continue making them through the decade under the name Ray, Goodman, and Brown. The catalog is substantial and largely overlooked by the mainstream conversation about 70s soul. Look at Me, I'm in Love is the record that points toward everything else that rewards discovery. Number 11, Brass Construction. Movin 1975. Brass Construction were a Brooklyn-based collective 9 musicians across a range of instruments whose sound combined the rhythmic discipline of funk with the harmonic complexity of jazz and the community energy of a group that had been playing together long enough to communicate without speaking. Movin reached the R&B top 10 in 1975 and introduced the group to a national audience that had not been following the New York soul-funk scenes where they had been developing. The record is built around a groove of extraordinary tightness, the specific lockdown that only comes from a band with genuine live performance experience, and a vocal arrangement that distributes the lead between multiple voices in a way that gives the record a collective rather than individual identity. The title is the entire argument. The record moves. Constantly, insistently, without pause or qualification, from the first measure to the last. It does not invite you to listen. It requires you to move. Brass Construction continued recording and performing through the decade. Their catalog rewards the listener who finds moving and decides to go further. But for the national mainstream, Movin was the arrival and the conclusion simultaneously. One record, one moment of visibility, and then the conversation moved on. The record did not move on. It is still right where it always was, still moving at exactly the same pace. Number 10, The Jackson. 5 I Am Love, 1975. By 1975, the Jackson 5 were in one of the most complicated periods of their Motown tenure, the commercial momentum of their early 70s. Peak was beginning to show strain. The group's relationship with the label was deteriorating toward the eventual departure that would bring them to Epic Records, and the 5 brothers from Gary, Indiana were navigating the transition from child stars to adult artists with the specific difficulty that transition always involves. I Am Love is a two-part epic, a 7-minute album track edited for single release that demonstrated the group's ambition at a moment when the industry was beginning to question whether their commercial peak had passed. The production is sophisticated in a way that the earlier Jackson 5 hits had not needed to be layered, thematically ambitious, asking the listener to stay for a journey rather than simply delivering a hook. It reached the R&B top 10. And it stands, in retrospect, as one of the clearest pieces of evidence that the group that would eventually split into Michael Jackson's solo career and the Jacksons' continued group work was already operating at a level of musical ambition that the Motown system could not fully accommodate. I Am Love is the sound of a group trying to tell their label something the label was not ready to hear. The record makes the argument clearly. The label's response or absence of one is part of the reason the departure that followed became inevitable. Number 9. Barry White, You're the First, The Last, My Everything, 1975. Barry White in 1975 was at the absolute commercial peak of one of the more remarkable careers in the history of R&B. The voice, that specific bass baritone, warm and impossibly deep, that had become one of the most recognized sounds in popular music, was on every radio station, in every club, in every context that required the specific sonic communication of adult romantic feeling. You're the First, The Last, My Everything reached number 2 on the pop chart and number 1 on the R&B chart. It is the fullest expression of the Barry White formula, the spoken word introduction, the orchestral swell, the declaration of absolute romantic commitment delivered with the specific authority of a voice that sounds like it has never doubted anything at its most completely realized. The record is forgotten in the specific sense that it has been absorbed into the general cultural understanding of Barry White as a phenomenon rather than heard as a specific record with a specific structure and a specific set of decisions behind it. When people think of Barry White, they think of the voice, the concept, the cultural category. They do not always think of this specific record and what makes it distinct from the other records in the category. This specific record is distinct. The orchestration, the tempo, the specific moment in the declaration, the first and the last and the everything, landing simultaneously in the lyric where the commitment reaches its fullest expression. These are choices made by specific people, producing a specific effect. The effect is permanent. The choices deserve to be heard as choices. Number 8. Eddie Kendricks. He's a Friend, 1975. Eddie Kendricks left the Temptations in 1971 to pursue a solo career, and the immediate commercial results of that decision were significant. Keep On Truckin' and Boogie Down in 1973 were top 5 pop hits that demonstrated his falsetto had genuine solo commercial viability outside the group context. By 1975, that momentum had produced a string of solo releases that received less and less promotional attention from Tamla Records, and the commercial results reflected the promotional investment rather than the quality of the music. He's a Friend is a gospel-influenced soul record, which is the most accurate way to describe what Eddie Kendricks' voice was always doing, underneath the pop soul production framework, the Motown system placed around it. The specific quality of his falsetto, the way it communicated both vulnerability and spiritual certainty simultaneously, was a direct expression of the gospel tradition in which he had been formed. The record reached the R&B top 10 and received modest pop crossover. And then it disappeared, absorbed into the mid-career gap between the 70s hits and the eventual classic lineup Temptations reunion that would bring Kendricks back to wider attention in the 1980s. His voice deserves to be heard in this record specifically, not as a Temptation, not in the reunion context. As a solo artist in 1975, making music that communicated exactly what his voice was built to communicate. Number 7. Rufus Fuffed. Chaka can, once get started, 1975, Rufus were one of the most important groups in the history of mid-70s R&B, a multiracial band from Chicago, whose combination of rock-influenced production And gospel soul vocal identity was genuinely distinctive at a moment when the genre was developing in multiple directions simultaneously, and Chaka Khan was the reason. Her voice raw, physically immediate, completely uninterested in the kind of pop smoothing that most commercial R&B of the period applied to its female vocalists was the element that made Rufus something more than a competent band with good material. She was the specific creative force that determined what the band was and what it could become. Once You Get Started reached the R&B Top 10 and the Pop Top 20. The production by Bobby Womack gives the record a specific warmth and directness that suited Chaka's voice perfectly, space rather than density. Room for the vocal to move rather than a framework that contained it. The record is a demonstration of what Chaka Khan could do inside a band context before she became a solo artist before I'm Every Woman and What Cha Gonna Do For Me and the full scope of the solo. Career established her as an individual force. Inside Rufus, with a band behind her that understood what her voice required, she could do things that the solo productions, for all their quality, sometimes could not replicate. Once You Get Started is the sound of that understanding at its clearest. Number 6. Smokey Robinson, Miracles, 1975. The record that gave the radio format its name was Quiet Storm, the record that demonstrated the full scope of what Smokey Robinson's mid-70s solo career could produce was Miracles. It reached number 4 on the pop chart and the R&B top 5 in 1975, his biggest solo commercial moment up to that point, and a record that demonstrated the songwriting intelligence and the vocal facility that had made him one of the great figures in the Motown story were not diminished by the passage of time. The lyric is a meditation on the specific quality of a love that has become so familiar it risks being taken for granted, and the sudden, clear-eyed recognition that what has become ordinary is actually extraordinary. That the routine of shared life contains miracles that only become visible when you stop long enough to actually look at them. This is Smokey Robinson at 61% of his typical lyrical density, which is still considerably more sophisticated than most songwriters operating at 100%. The economy of the writing, the specific images he chooses, the way the lyric builds its argument quietly without announcing that it is making an argument. These are the qualities that Bob Dylan was, recognizing when he called Robinson America's greatest living poet. The record ruled 1975. And then it was absorbed into the general understanding of mid-career Smokey Robinson in a way that has made it harder to hear clearly. Heard clearly, which is the only honest way to hear it, it is one of the finest records he ever made. Number 5. The Pointer Sisters, How Long, Betcha Got a Chick on the Side, 1975. The Pointer Sisters in 1975 were one of the most genuinely eclectic acts in American popular music, an act whose commercial positioning was consistently unclear because their artistic range was consistently wider than any single format could contain. Country records, R&B records, pop records. Performances that looked and sounded like they had arrived from a completely different decade. How Long, Betcha Got a Chick on the Side is a straight R&B record, one of the most direct and most commercially focused things they had recorded to that point. The title tells you everything about the emotional content. The performance gives you everything the title promised. Ruth Pointer's lead vocal is the record's defining element, a voice of considerable individual power delivering a lyric of complete sharp-edged directness about infidelity. Not sad, not pleading. Knowing the specific tone of a woman who has figured out what is happening and is naming it with the confidence of someone who requires confirmation of what she already knows. It reached the R&B Top 5 and the Pop Top 20. And it was somewhat lost in the broader discussion of the Pointer Sisters' career, which tends to focus on the early 80s commercial peak of Slow Hand. I know you want us both, and I know the reason why. And I'm So Excited at the expense of the mid-70s work that demonstrated what the group was capable of when the commercial machinery was pointed directly at their actual strengths. This record is those strengths at full power. Focused, direct, completely assured. Number 4, Tavares. It Only Takes a Minute, 1975. The Tavares brothers Ralph, Pooch, Chubby, Butch, and Tiny from Bedford, Massachusetts were a family vocal group whose harmonic identity was built on the specific intimacy of voices that had been hearing each other since childhood. The blend was not arranged. It was developed through years of singing together in a domestic context before the professional context existed. It Only Takes a Minute. Girl reached the top 10 pop and top 5 R&B in 1975 and introduced the group to a national audience with a record of such pure, direct, completely enjoyable energy that the response was immediate. The production is tight, the harmonies are warm. The lead vocal by Chubby Tavares delivers the lyric with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely means every word of it. It is not a complicated record. It does not make difficult demands of the listener.
And I'm Ralph.
Yeah, that's a great song, and I don't blame him for hollering, you guys.
What it offers is the specific pleasure of a perfectly executed piece of mid-70s soul pop record that does everything it sets out to do with complete facility and complete generosity. The career that followed it, Heaven Must Be Missing an Angel, More Than a Woman, Don't Take Away the Music, demonstrated that the quality of It Only Takes a Minute was not a fluke. The Tavares catalog rewards exploration. This record is the entry point, and it is exactly what an entry point should be: immediate, compelling, and pointing toward something larger. Number 3, David Ruffin, Walk Away from Love, 1975. David Ruffin is remembered first as a temptation. The voice on My Girl. The voice on Ain't Too Proud to Beg. The voice that during the classic Temptations period of the mid-1960s represented the specific combination of gospel rawness and pop accessibility that made the group the most commercially successful act in the Motown catalog. He was fired in 1968. The personal difficulties, the demands, the erratic behavior, the dawning substance issues made him impossible for the group to sustain. And his solo career, which should have been straightforward, given the commercial case the Temptations had already made for his voice, was instead complicated by the same issues that had ended the group tenure. Walk Away from Love is the exception. A record so completely, perfectly constructed around what his voice could do, produced by Van McCoy, built on a soul ballad framework of genuine emotional sophistication that everything else fell away. And what remained was the voice, the specific, raw, completely unguarded vocal instrument that had always been there, and that the complications of his personal life had been obscuring. It reached the top 10 pop and top 5 R&B. It was the biggest solo hit of his career. And it deserves to be heard not as a curiosity about what David Ruffin was capable of outside the Temptations, but as proof of what he was capable of, full stop. The Temptations context produced the records, the solo context produced this one. Both deserve equal weight. He died in 1991 at the age of 50. The voice that made Walk Away from Love is still present in every second of the recording. Number 2. The O'Jays' I Love Music, 1975 by 1975. The O'Jays had already produced some of the most important records in the Philadelphia International catalog. Backstabbers, Love Train, For the Love of Money. The political urgency, the social vision, the specific moral seriousness that Kenny Gamble and Leon Huff brought to their productions with Eddie. Levert and Walter Williams had made the group one of the defining voices of the early 70s soul era. I Love Music represented a deliberate simplification of that vision, a record that was not about betrayal or economic exploitation or social collapse, but about the most fundamental possible relationship between a person and music itself. The feeling in the presence of a record that does what a great record does. The specific quality of that experience, physical, emotional, impossible to fully articulate, named and celebrated with complete directness. It reached the top 5 pop and top 5 R&B, and became one of the group's most enduring catalog entries, the record that MFSB had arranged and the O'Jays had delivered as a pure, unambiguous statement of musical love. But it sits in a different position in the public memory than Backstabbers or Love Train, the records that define the group's identity. It is the O'Jays without the social vision, without the moral argument, without the specific weight of the Philadelphia International political project. Just the music, just the love of it, which is, in its own way, as profound a statement as anything the more serious records made. Number 1, Natalie Cole, This Will Be, in Everlasting Love, 1975. Natalie Cole was 25 years old. Her father was Nat King Cole, one of the most celebrated entertainers in the history of American popular music.
So glad that you rectified my mind. This will be
A man whose shadow was as large as any in the industry, and whose daughter had spent her entire life being evaluated in relation to it. This Will Be was her debut single. And it was one of the most complete, most confident, most fully realized debut performances in the history of soul music. The production by Marvin Yancey and Chuck Jackson is urgent from the first measure, a rhythm section that does not wait, that establishes the tempo and the energy immediately, and does not allow either to diminish across the entire running time. The arrangement is layered without being cluttered. The horns add momentum. The background vocals respond with the immediacy of musicians who understood what the lead vocal was doing and matched its energy completely. And the lead vocal, 25 years old, the daughter of Nat King Cole, standing in front of a production that was asking everything of her, asking for joy, urgency, authority. Complete commitment to the emotional premise of the lyric from the very first word. She delivered all of it, with complete authority, as if she had been making records this good for years. It reached number 1 on the R&B chart. It won the Grammy Award for Best Rhythm and Blues Vocal Performance Female. It launched one of the significant solo careers of the decade. And introduced a voice that the industry and the audience immediately recognized as something that needed to be heard. The shadow of Nat King Cole did not diminish what his daughter did. This Will Be is not a record that exists in relation to anyone else's legacy. It exists entirely in its own right as an arrival so complete that it made previous absence of Natalie Cole from the commercial landscape feel, in retrospect, like something that should have been fixed considerably earlier. One debut single, number 1 R&B, Grammy Award, a voice fully present from the very first note of the very first record. That is why it is number 1. Not because it is the most forgotten record on this list, it may be the most remembered, but because 1975 produced it, and because most remembered and fully understood are not the same thing, and because the story of how a 25-year-old woman stepped out from